Good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Montgomery, and I am the Regional Director of Movers and Shakers. A warm welcome to you all for the first of the Movers and Shakers event in a series of 4 in collaboration with Stockport Council and Stockport Mayoral Development Corporation. Today's topic is how do we deliver levelling up, the challenges facing towns in making levelling up a reality. A bit more of that in a second. For those of you who don't know Movers and Shakers, we have been running first-class property and construction events for over 25 years, bringing together key players from both the public and private sectors. And the big initiative for Movers and Shakers in 2021 is how to drive more and better public and private sector collaboration, locally and indeed globally. Firstly, a big thank you to our sponsors today, Muse Developments. Muse Developments is the UK's leading name in mixed-use development and urban regeneration, with a major range of schemes across the country delivering vibrant, diverse and connected places. Through collaboration, Muse brings together the best of public and private sector to deliver transformational change directly to benefit the communities. Muse is a national developer with regional offices across the UK and is part of the Morgan Sindall Group, who are a leading UK construction and regeneration organisation. So today, the first in a series of 4, as I mentioned, how do we deliver levelling up? The government set out in the Queen's speech for levelling up opportunities across all parts of the UK, supporting jobs, businesses and economic growth, and addressing the impact of the pandemic on public services is at the heart of the Build Back Better agenda. But what does that mean? What does it mean to town centres? How can it be delivered? What vehicles can we use to ensure this happens? Lots of fantastic and interesting questions. And as a result, we have created a panel today of excellent contributors and a brief introduction to all of them. First off is Dame Alison Nimmo, who is the Non-Executive Director for MHCLG, St Modwen Property Group, Berkeley Group and Imperial College London's Property Committee. Alison has been delivering regeneration for 35 years across the UK in various executive roles. For 8 years, she was the CEO of the Crown Estate, and Alison is passionate about sustainability and is indeed a built environment ambassador for UK GBC at COP26. Along with all her non-exec director roles, earlier this year, she was part of a small steering group helping Peter Freeman with his review of Homes England as the new chair, and she was a member of the government's Urban Recovery Task Force. Matt Crompton, the Managing Director of Muse Developments. As I mentioned, Muse Developments are one of the best mixed-use developers and urban regeneration specialists in the UK, with a forward development pipeline of over £2.5 billion. Matt has considerable experience of commercial, residential and mixed-use developments. Tom Walker. Tom is the recently appointed Director of the Levelling Up Unit in the Cabinet Office. Tom has been a civil servant for over 20 years, working on economic growth, regeneration, housing, planning and environmental policy. He has previously been Director of Environmental Strategy at DEFRA, the Deputy Chief Executive at Homes England, the Director of Cities and Local Growth Unit at BEIS and MHCLG. And today our chair is Caroline Baker. Caroline is the head of the Manchester office for Cushman & Wakefield, and she is a regeneration specialist. She has held and she led the multidisciplinary team which prepared the strategic regeneration framework for Stockport Town Centre West, which supported its designation as an MDC. I'm sure you'll agree that is an exciting mix of contributors. A quick overview. Lord Kerslake would like to say a few words to kick things off this morning. Lord Kerslake will hand over to Tom, and Tom's opening remarks will set the foundation for this levelling up session. Then we'll move on to the panel session with the panellists I have just referred to. Please don't forget to ask questions. On the platform, there is a questions tab, and those questions will be directed towards Caroline, who will field them at the appropriate time. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I shall hand you over to Lord Kerslake, who will kickstart today. Lord Kerslake, over to you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and I'd like to add my welcome to Simon's for today. The first of 4 events, as Simon has said, and we plan to run them throughout the rest of 2021. They're delivered by Movers and Shakers in association with Stockport Council and Stockport Mayoral Development Corporation, a new and excellent initiative which I have the privilege of chairing. They'll focus on how we can deliver levelling up, and the key word here is delivery, particularly through our collective work in regeneration. We're going to have future events that look at investment and sustainability as their focus. But today, we're focusing on delivering levelling up and making it a reality for towns, especially those towns outside the southeast of England. I think you'll agree that we've got an outstanding panel for the first of our events, and I'd like to thank them profusely for taking part. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Muse Developments, for what I think is going to be a really interesting and lively discussion. I'd now like to hand over to Tom.
Great. Thank you very much, Lord Kersake, and good afternoon, everybody. As the introduction said, my name's Tom Walker, so I'm the director of the Levelling Up unit in the Cabinet Office, which I'll say a little bit more about in the moment. Part of that role, actually working right at the centre of the government, as opposed to an MHCLG and BAYS, means one of my experiences is to account for why all of our previous attempts at regeneration haven't worked. Now, I don't actually believe that's true. Many of them have worked, but my long career has seen me involved in neighbourhood planning, local government reorganisation, housing market renewal, enterprise zones, and then the creation of the mayoral combined authorities. And the reason for taking the job in the Cabinet Office to shape this agenda and drive it forward is to bring all of that experience into the policy making environment. And the last thing I did on this agenda before coming back into Whitehall was help Nick Walkley set up Homes England as the Deputy Chief Exec there. So I hope, obviously speaking to an audience, I can't see anyone, but I hope that many of you I've worked with in the past across the country. Inevitably at this stage in our process, there's not so much detail on levelling up as a policy that I can give you, but I will give you a sense of what we're doing and hopefully how you can be involved over the next few months, and crucially some questions that when we get into the dialogue and for the panel members to pick up that I'd be very interested in developing that engagement with. So the first thing to say about levelling up is the government is already doing a huge amount. There are new funds, there are programmes right across the government. There's a skills white paper. The Chancellor was on the radio this morning talking about the plan for jobs. And our role in the Levelling Up unit is to really build on everything that the government has announced so far. And as we come out of the COVID emergency, look to the things that government should be doing more of, new policies aligned with the spending review. And that's the work we're doing. What is the backdrop to levelling up? I think most people in this audience and on the panel will fully recognise the regional disparities that we see, the intra-regional disparities that we have in this country. So in a sense, the question isn't what does the evidence say, it's how to design the policies that make the right interventions, to create the right flexible funding, and to get the right leadership in place. So those are the sorts of themes that we're doing. I think the crucial thing about levelling up compared to some of the things I've been involved in recent years is it isn't just a traditional economic growth agenda, and nor is it just a city region agenda. So what does that mean? It means on the span that we will be looking at educational attainment, about how we connect regeneration with public service reform, and to address that sense of community pride, or in other words, what does it feel like to live around here? And when I say it's not just about city regions, you'll have seen this already through the Towns Fund and through the Levelling Up Fund, but it is an agenda for every part of the country. I think building on some of the successes we've had in city centre regeneration and city region mayoral authorities, but taking it much further beyond that. If you haven't been following this closely, you may not have seen, but most of you I think will, Neil O'Brien is the Prime Minister's advisor. So my job is to work with Neil on developing this agenda. Neil, I think, will be well known, as I say, to many of you. He was the Chancellor, George Osborne's special advisor, and he worked on Theresa May's industrial strategy white paper. So Neil is the principal political advisor on this. I'm leading the team in the Cabinet Office supporting him. I mean, the one thing to say coming to then work on the agenda is I've talked about the breadth already as we see it, but you can't turn on the radio or read a report from a think tank or a lobby group that hasn't put levelling up at the front of its agenda. Inevitably, there is something about everyone wanting to show how their work is contributing to levelling up, arguing the case for resources at the spending review. But I think it's actually an agenda that has caught the imagination, partly because people recognise that there's something deep and important to do about the structure of the UK economy, and partly because I think it has a sort of call to arms within it, which people are responding to. So we've got think tank reports from across the board, which we're engaged with. We've got the sort of commentariat, and I point to an article in The Economist a couple of weeks ago, Bagehot's leader column on the Geordie Tory phenomenon. And there is analysis coming out of all of the main research bodies pointing us towards what we might do, where, and at different geographic levels. So we're in a deep policy making process, and the offer here, and the reason want to come to these sorts of events before we publish the white paper, is to say, do get in touch, preferably sort of through organisations like Movers or Shakers or some of your representative bodies, but very keen, particularly on the question of physical regeneration, how we take it to different markets. Would be very interested to engage further on this. And it should go without saying, but I'll say it for emphasis, that the government sees the private sector as being absolutely the heart of the levelling up agenda. So clearly public policy has a major role, how we use public money, how we shape those leadership conversations, but private sector led growth, partnership with the private sector, the thing that lies at the very heart of the Movers and Shakers organisation and your events, is what we're most interested in developing. And then just to give some examples, I mean, Bob has already talked about Stockport, was on my list, but a couple of others. So last week I was in Humber talking with business leaders there, people involved in the refinery, with Drax, about how do they strengthen their economic partnership across both sides of the Humber Bank to harness the potential opportunities of net zero, but also the challenges. And the Humber is interesting because it doesn't have a mayoral combined authority. It straddles, to state the obvious, a deep estuary. And so you've got an economy operating both sides of the water. And then at its heart, you've got Grimsby, the town that pioneered the approach to town deals, who is now making progress on delivering the sort of agenda that others on this panel will talk about. So someone like Humber becomes really interesting for us. How do you take those massive opportunities plus challenges of decarbonisation and translate the benefits that we might see down to the city or town and then neighbourhood level? Stockport I was going to mention, but I think others on the panel might do more about that. All I would say is I came 2 years ago, just as I was finishing up at Homes England, as part of a 3-day visit to the northwest and to Manchester, and pleased to see the progress and the sort of direction and achievement and impact that a mayoral development corporation can bring. And that takes me to Tees Valley. So I was very involved in my previous role when the steelworks collapsed until Tees Valley, where Ben Houchin has become mayor, where we also set up a mayoral development corporation. And again, those key ingredients of strong leadership, rock solid, excuse me, business, public sector partnership, and then a strategic plan with work now happening on site. Another example of the sort of thing that we'll be looking to spread further across the country. And the fourth example I just wanted to briefly mention, I had a conversation with Sir John Peace yesterday about the Midlands Engine. And so the reason for mentioning this is there are things that we can do at different geographic scales here. And I'm very interested in where the opportunities might lie for pan-regional collaboration, as well as focusing on city regions as we establish them, or individual towns. So what should we be doing at that scale above individual LEPs or above individual mayoral combined authorities? And then just one final point of substance, and then I'll finish these opening remarks with a few points of reflection which we might draw out in the conversation. The final point is to say that the Levelling Up white paper will be a union-wide endeavour. In other words, not just an England only project. And I think where you in the private sector colleagues in the audience can help us think about that is where you don't see the boundary and where you see there are opportunities for partnership into Wales, into Scotland and into Northern Ireland. Obviously, I say that respecting the devolution settlements, but there is something about levelling up, which means, unlike some of our traditional growth programmes, they have to be union-wide, not just England only. So things that I would be interested to draw out on the panel, I mean, reflections on the current agenda, that run of programmes that the government has already started and what's working and what isn't working. I'd welcome views on that. Contributions on policy changes you'd like to see or gaps in the agenda. That's obviously what we're working on, but calibrating that with what you are seeing or what you would like to see in the white paper. Thirdly, intelligence on what the market is saying, how the market is responding in different parts of the country as we emerge from COVID. You may not want to share that online in the full forum, but if you've got insights you want to share with us in the Cabinet Office and number 10, that would be hugely welcome. And then the final one would be, what are the trends beyond net zero, beyond the embrace of hybrid working and perhaps the movement out of offices? What other long run trends might levelling up have to grapple with? As it is obviously a long term, not just a short term agenda. So I'll wrap up those reflections there. I'd love to come back to a future event when we've published the white paper in the autumn and talk more about the substance, but I hope for now that gives you a flavour for what we're doing and perhaps how you can support us in our thinking. Thank you very much, Lord Kerslake.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really useful in terms of setting the context and gave us lots of opportunities in terms of the panel to be able to really share some of our thinking. I think I'd like to turn to you, Alison, to start off with. Obviously, you've had a very impressive career around physically delivering regeneration on the ground with a public sector hat on. And really, from your experience, given this opportunity to share your thinking with Tom, what do you think the levelling up policy agenda really needs to focus on to make the difference that it needs to do in terms of the levelling up agenda?
I think I'd just start by saying it was really interesting to hear what Tom had to say. It's a very important agenda and it's clearly getting a lot of sort of brain power from right across government. But just listening to Tom's remarks, it's a very broad agenda and it needs to be a broad agenda. And I think it needs to try and do two things. One is really focusing on sort of need and inequality, but it's also about unlocking potential as well. So it's all about levelling up, certainly not levelling down. And it feels like the autumn's a really critical time, not just on the levelling up white paper, but addressing issues like devolution. And then, as Tom said, the all-important spending review. And I think there's going to be some really tough decisions to make. I think in terms of focus, I suppose I'd say three things. The first is really big challenge about the immediate sort of post-COVID recovery. You know, not only its huge impact on the economy and our urban areas, you know, particularly our towns and cities, and some of our weaker towns have been hit the hardest and will need the most help to sort of restructure and get back on their feet. I think the second thing is it's the year of COP26 and the Committee on Climate Change has just issued its report to Parliament. So I would say the race to levelling up also needs to be the race to net zero, and that needs to sit at the heart of the agenda. Now's our last reasonable chance to stay within the 1.5 degrees. And the third, and Lord Kerslake touched on this, we really need to be clear about how we're going to deliver this very bold, very ambitious and exciting agenda. We need a robust and capable public sector. We need that right balance of devolving, you know, power, money and decision making. You know, the best regeneration I've seen is place-based. And it also means we need to make sure we've got the right tools, and the subsidy control bill that the government's been working on is really important to ensure that we have things like gap funding and real flexibility around state aid, so we can, you know, assemble sites and really get on with the sort of, if you like, the heavy lifting bit of delivering the physical bit of this change.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Alison. And that focus around delivery takes us really nicely into giving Matt the opportunity really to share from his perspective around development as a private sector developer who works very closely with the public sector. What do you feel is the critical areas that Levelling Up need to focus to allow you to continue to work effectively with the public sector to drive delivery on the ground?
Well, thanks, Caroline. Just something before I do that Alison might have said in terms of focusing on the weakest towns. For me, I think that wherever Levelling Up is focused needs to be in the right places. It needs to be in the places where there's untapped potential. And maybe it's a discussion for later in terms of, is that the weakest towns? Because I guess we can't make everywhere outside Zone 1 central London level. It just doesn't work like that. You know, Cumbria has its own economy, the Northwest does, the Midlands does, and the like. So for me, yes, we've got to try and address the disparity between London and the rest of the country. But I guess we've got to focus it in areas where there's real untapped potential for me. We've got to produce some real strong, sustainable cases for investment, where you've got, you know, strong public sector and private sector organisations with strong, focused, courageous leaders to make sure that whatever Levelling Up assistance that particular area gets, it's put into the right hands with the right sort of sustainable potential. So town and city centres, I guess, is a key driver, and we'd hope that, you know, levelling up help in towns and city centres will have a catalytic effect on, you know, the hinterland and hopefully ultimately the regions, so that the whole levelling up can join up between the various regions. And I guess we just need to look at return on investment like you would do, you know, as a pure private sector investor. Where is this investment? I don't mean investment in terms of money. I mean in terms of commitment. You know, how can we get the right return on investment? I wouldn't spread the love too thinly. Personally, I'd focus on areas, I say, that have got untapped potential and sustainable growth. Not where it's politically astute to invest, but where it'll actually make most impact. But I guess, you know, we can't make everywhere equal, but we can help create sustainable growth, provided it's put in the right place and for the right things.
Yeah, that's great, Matt. Thank you for that. I think coming back to you, Tom, and clearly it's really good to know that somebody who's leading the policy agenda around levelling up has had so much involvement in a number of the other initiatives. And I think as a practitioner myself, that making sure that we are learning the lessons from the past as opposed to repeating some of the mistakes is going to be really important. So I suppose bringing all of your experience of delivering regeneration and the journey that you're starting around the policy at the moment, what do you see as the most difficult challenges around levelling up at the moment?
So, I mean, I think it's in some of what has already been said by Alison and Matt. The obvious challenge is the areas that most need levelling up, and that's a very shorthand way of putting it, are sometimes those with the weakest capacity, the least experience, or just the thinnest amount of resource. So I think the big challenge is targeting interventions on the areas of greatest need, which is a slightly different thing to return on investment, and then crucially getting the partnership, the capacity there, whether it's across the public sector or between public and private, to make the very best of that. I think that's the challenge particularly when it comes to regeneration. There are then a whole load of more practical things. So everyone knows that the cocktail of funding pots makes sometimes it much harder to do things at a scheme or project-based level. I think the quality of leadership, as Matt has just talked about, and I think some of the reflections are actually for central government, the sort of critique of chopping and changing policy, believing in different types of partnerships and then shifting on to the next thing. So there is something about sort of stability and confidence here, that we've got sticking power on the long run, agenda. And of course that requires investable propositions. It can't just be, as others have said, a jam spreading exercise or trying to do everything everywhere. But I think those are some of the essential ingredients. And I already talked about Tees Valley, Lord Kerslake mentioned Stockport. I think where you see those sorts of partnerships, sense of a long-term plan, skin in the game from partners, you start to then build the confidence for success. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I think from my experience of working with a number of local authorities, I was on a seminar recently where somebody sort of asked about strategies and what local authorities are doing. I think in many cases, local authorities, the good ones, the ones with strong leaderships, already have quite a strong strategy. And what they would like to have is the flexibility to be able to engage with central government and funding pots to be able to deliver in the way that they understand for their areas, as opposed to sometimes in the past and even in the recent past is having to sort of quickly respond to the current funding pot, as opposed to being able to have a longer dialogue that really allows the flexibility of them being able to move forward with some of the projects that they know are needed in their area. And often that is the public and the private doing that together, as opposed to one or other of them coming up with an idea and then asking for some money. So I think that the ability to have flexibility will be really exciting, I think. So I think unless Matt or Alison, you want to comment on your view around challenges, I was going. Matt looks as though he's ready to chip in there.
The challenges. I don't think the challenges are necessarily any more difficult or tricky than the challenges that local authorities in the private sector have in their daily relationships. It's just really encouraging to know that, levelling up is a reality now. We had the Lions report where it was moving jobs outside London. I know part of levelling up is also moving some of Whitehall departments out into the other parts of the country. There's loads of issues, loads of challenges, but I don't think any of them are hugely different to the challenges that we always face in trying to do the right thing and create, sustainable, long-term, powerful regeneration. All the challenges will be there, but I guess if we're focusing on the less strong towns, then those challenges will probably just be amplified.
Yeah.
I would just say, I think having government looking and thinking hard about the wider policy piece. So we're joining all the bits of government up and having a very clear sort of framework and context. Because at the moment, I think there's, it feels quite piecemeal. And so I think having that sort of clear context, so, the sum of the part, the overall is greater than the sum of the parts, if you like, I think is really, really important. And I do think we just need to recognise that, local government and the public sector has been incredibly resilient through COVID, but it's left big scars. And as Tom was hinting at, sort of some big challenges in terms of capability and capacity. And I think we need to recognise that a lot of what we're going to be really delivering on the ground does actually get delivered at a place and a local level. So I think being able to work with and support and partner that sort of local leadership, public and private, is just a really important part of the equation. And I think it'll be fascinating to see how the sort of geography of spend and where the emphasis is going to be. Because as I say, with this spending review, there's going to be some pretty tough decisions to make. But I think one of the keys to it is you know, joining the bits of the jigsaw together. So at the moment, the funding is very program based. We need to look at what's the right balance between programs and then, you know, place, because some of the best projects I've been involved with, you know, you really equip local partners with, you know, they've got a clear vision, dedicated team, and I suppose Stockport MDC is a good example with Bob at the helm. Sort of, you know, you've got dedicated team, dedicated money, clear plan, really strong leadership, because this stuff is quite hard to do. You know, it takes time and it takes consistency, as Tom said, year in, year out, to make it deliver on the ground. So I think getting that right balance. But I think it's really exciting. You know, there's such an important thing for us to be doing as a country. It's not the first time we've tried, but you know, I'm really hopeful that we can learn a lot of lessons, good and bad, from what we've done before. And you know, the time is now to crack on with this. And I think COVID has given us a really, and the climate crisis has given us a real double challenge and impetus to sort of really get on with this.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, that those lessons learned are really interesting, and I think what we know from the sort of places that we're all familiar with that have been transformed, that is a commitment of both the public and the private for 10, 15, 20 years in many cases, as opposed to the short period that is sometimes available for some of the funding pots. And just, you know, moving from those challenges to celebrating the really good examples that we're all aware of. Alison, I'd just like to ask you if you'd like to sort of share with us some of the good examples, the best practice that you've seen whilst you've been as operating as a regeneration expert for a number of years, and the sort of essential elements of those.
I think as practitioners, we've all seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I think we need to be clear as to, you know, what are the key ingredients of success. And I've done small stuff, so many lifetimes ago, small coastal town like Whitehaven, regenerating that in Cumbria, right up to, I suppose, the other end of the spectrum, London 2012 and the Games, with a very generous budget, so to speak, and everything in between, Sheffield City Centre with Bob, Manchester after the bomb back in 1996. And I think we can, you know, learn lots of lessons from that thing. One of my favourite projects is actually King's Cross, and again, long-term projects. A few of us have put together this book. It's called Regenerating Cities. Wahid Nazir from Birmingham put it together and got 10 practitioners. I'll put a link in the chat. It's from Howard Bernstein to the late great Tony Pidgley to people like David Partridge at King's Cross, and sort of said, what are these real ingredients of success?
Oh, unfortunately, it looks as though we've got a technical hitch there. So I think hopefully we might be able to come back to that. Matt, can I bring you in then in terms of sharing some of your experience of best practice and lessons learned?
Yeah, sure. We never stopped learning. You know, who'd have known that, you know, COVID and online retailing would have supercharged how our cities and towns change, how we all behave. But in terms of sort of the best practice that we've learned is public-private partnerships are definitely the way forward if you're looking at long-term sustainable regeneration. I guess it's, you know, harnessing those complementary skills that our local authority partners have, us in the regeneration world have, working together in a complementary way. I think you get the best possible and potential outcome, and they could be partnerships at a project level, a bit like our relationship with Stockport, Stockport Exchange, where we worked with Stockport for many years prior to them acquiring the site next to the railway station. And we're now working with them in partnership on a project basis, a multi-phase project basis, where, you know, we share ups and downs together. We meet infrequently because we understand how stretched our local authority friends are. So they entrust us with one of their key assets in in the town centre and we do a good job, and we come back and take a lot of the burden off our local authority friends. And of course, we bring a different skill set to that. So I think, working public-private on a project-by-project basis, you look at our relationship with Homes England and Legal in General, in English Cities Fund, another interesting public-private partnership where, we're working together across England, from far south as Plymouth, across into Canning Town, up into Salford, delivering area-based, place-changed regeneration, but using our Homes England colleagues and our Legal and General colleagues in maybe in a different way that we would with Stockport. So we are a strategic partnership working with local authorities. So again, a public-private partnership working with a public sector partner in places like Salford and East London. And then, of course, you've got the Stockport Mayoral Corporation, and that's taken it to another level. So we're now a public-private partnership working within a site within the Mayoral Development Corporation remit, as is Capital Centric and other developers. So that's a great way of getting a grand vision for a town centre, but working collaboratively with other public and private sector regenerators. So there's different levels of public-private partnerships working at different scales, but all with the long-term game of, as I say, growth and sustainable growth for everybody's benefit. So I think harnessing the public sector skills alongside skills of the private sector, whatever guise, it has to be the best way, in my view, of using this levelling up firepower to best advantage.
And I think, from my experience of working alongside those in Stockport as well, I think that the place the centre of that, and I think there's a recognition that's about physical change, but is about both supporting the local communities and bringing new communities in, but also about thinking around service delivery, service excellence, and transport and connectivity, and the relationship not just within the new area, the new community is going to be created, but how they fit into the wider community in the wider town centre, but also within Greater Manchester and within the Northwest, and how interconnected they all are, that we have to be thinking around how we start to change places to bring all of those up, as opposed to in competition with each other. And hopefully, Alison, that's quite a good segue to allow you to come back in after the technology seems to have to come back to let you share some more of your experience of delivery on the ground as well.
Caroline, we just mentioned briefly then the connectivity, and something I wasn't going to mention because I wasn't ready for it, but I think as our town centres struggle, one thing we mustn't let wither on the vine is the public transport to and from them. It would be so easy for us to allow the train services to be less frequent, the bus provisions to be less potent within the hinterland, because it's not hugely economic. But the minute we start to lose that connectivity, especially with public transport, with the the future sustainability and net zero carbon ambitions, I think we're going to start to struggle, because putting it back, as you know, through Beeching's efforts way back, it's hard. Yeah. So I do think you touched on infrastructure there, and I think that's crucial. Sorry, Alison.
No, that's great. I mean, I think people have talked about partnership and leadership. I think the thing we mustn't forget is vision and ambition. And I think that's where Tom started the conversation. The world is changing around us at an incredible rate. And I think the pandemic has accelerated a huge amount of change. And there will be winners and losers. And I think thinking through sort of technological change and, being outside of the European Union now, there's all sorts of things that have changed. The pace of change has been extraordinary in the last few years. And what we've done in the past, whether it's, models of physical development in our towns and city centres, or some of the economic things we have tried, won't work in this future world. And I think we really do need to sort of reimagine what is going to be our economic drivers of the future, whether it's a sort of gigafactory in Sunderland and electric cars, you know, big game changers, whether it's some of the stuff I was involved in the Crown Estate in terms of, you know, growing a sort of global leader in offshore wind so we can decarbonize the grid. You know, we need to be thinking really big and really ambitious in terms of our economy, as well as then thinking about, you know, what is the future purpose of our urban areas if we're all working from our bedrooms like most of us are at the moment, and moving to hybrid working. You know, the city centres aren't going to be anchored by the sort of Debenham stores and the John Lewis's that they used to be in the past. You know, we have to actually be quite ambitious in terms of how we rethink these new models and what people really want from their urban areas, and you know, how technology is going to, you know, really radically change how we think of things going forward. And as I say, with the whole sort of climate change, the innovation that we need to bring to bear on our sort of economy and many of our businesses to really reap the rewards of, you know, the sort of knowledge that we all have. And, you know, as Tom alluded to at the beginning, it's as much about rethinking health and education and skills as it is the physical environment. And I actually think it's a really exciting time. It's quite daunting because there's a lot of really heavy lifting to do. But I think we just, you know, we really need to be ambitious and visionary in how we set this out and bring all these different themes together so we have a really clear plan, because all these things, whether it's, you know, infrastructure, whether that's 5G or railways or public transport, they all need to come together to create, I suppose, this brave new future, really.
Yeah. No, and I think, Tom, I'd be keen to bring you back in here. I think partly to give you an opportunity to respond to one of the questions we've got, and something that you touched on earlier. I think it's that sense of the pressure. I think, you know, all the areas that we're all involved in, and we've touched on a number, particularly around the sort of town centres and the city centres, and the importance of being able to level up about those. But a question from the audience is around what are the prospects for those areas that aren't in the red wall, northern Midlands seats. You know, there's a sort of a feeling around levelling up to some extent has been sort of hijacked politically, and clearly what you're grappling now with is trying to think around the balance between the geographies of that are quite complicated. So it's not just the north and south, it's not just the urban and the rural. So I'm sure we'd all be delighted to hear a little bit of your thinking around some of those, how you're starting to think around that distribution of focus, I suppose, going forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, happy to. I mean, I think the first thing to say is to repeat 2 points I made right at the start. So one, we're thinking about the union. So in other words, it's for the whole country. And then within England, this is a move beyond, as the government's already signalled in the manifesto and some of those early announcements, beyond the focus on city regions, which is really where our attention was with the mayoral devolution deals. Although we did growth deals right across the country, the sort of added focus was on the city region mayoral combined authorities, and those are now maturing as our organisations. So the agenda, and this is a little bit in the policy work that we're doing, is how do you spread, and I don't mean that in a sort of economic jam spreading way, I just mean how do you focus on the full range of places and tailor policies to the specific geographies. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. I mean, on the specific will places not in the red wall lose out? Look, you know, ministers will take decisions, and there's plenty of public debate about this. But what I would say is part of the reason why money has gone to so-called red wall seats and similar places is because the electoral outcome was an expression of some of that dissatisfaction, which the current sort of economic balance, the sense of pride drives. So there is some inevitable evidence there. But I'd repeat what I said, that the agenda is really a whole country agenda, and things like the Shared Prosperity Fund, we're still to design the criteria. And then to pick up on something Alison said, and there's a theme running through all of this crucial point about taking a place-based approach is really, really important. It's worth repeating, even though it may seem obvious. Levelling up has to be about doing things differently in different geographies. If you're to close a gap, whether that's on productivity, whether it's on life expectancy, it needs a tailored response. And I think what people, leaders in the sector, colleagues on this sort of event can do is to really make the case for that, because as Lord Kerslake knows, although you can get rhetoric in favour of place-based approaches, every department in Whitehall is incentivised really to drive its narrow focus on skills improvement, crime, etc., etc. So part of the policy debate here is how do we actually allow that pooling of resource, flexibility to respond to circumstances, ability to sort of bend the rule book on funding, all of those sorts of ingredients in individual places. And I think illustrative examples of where people have done that, potential projects where you want to look at capital and physical regeneration alongside access to employment, skills, educational attainment, whatever those links are really, really important, because there is an inertia in the system. It's inevitable, it's sort of incentivized. And what we've got to do is find a way of sort of squaring the accountability question. Ministers want to see things happen. They want to be able to target resources with the flexibility needed in a place to make the very best use and best impact of resources at a place's disposal. And to repeat the point, that should then be explained, illustrated, highlighted, propositions put forward right across the country, not just in any one part. As you said, Caroline, it's not towns or cities, it's not rural or urban, it's not those so-called red wall seats or other places. I think it is genuinely an open agenda for the whole country.
Okay, thank you. I think there's another interesting question from the audience that I think I'll pose to Matt to start off with, and that's something that you probably grappled with in the past potentially, and I could be linked to Brexit as well, which we've managed to do quite well with not raising so far in the conversation. But there's a question here around our current public sector procurement process an impediment to the public sector selecting the right private sector partners?
It's a double-edged sword, Caroline, as you know, because you're hugely experienced in it. Operated right, then I don't think it's an impediment at all. When I say operated right, with the right weighting on the right criteria, and with Tom mentioned earlier, flexing rule books. I don't mean flexing it outside the rules, but interpreting the rules to get, I guess, the best result. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the senior officer in the council would just deem something best value, and whether it was the most expensive, the least expensive, the flashiest, or the most basic, as long as that individual, like a Section 151 officer, said, we're good to go with this developer or this contractor, let's do it, trust me, it's right. I don't think the world was any different. And getting into Europe and all the rules around procurement at the start was a real headache, because the people were scared to interpret the rules. So everything had to be scrutinised to the nth degree, and percentages applied to weightings and you quite often will get the wrong result from all of that. Whereas a more flexible interpretation of what's best value in a relationship in a town centre has to be the way forward. I don't think that sort of, we clearly won't call it OJU anymore, but that sort of analysis as to who the public sector should be aligning themselves to, committing themselves to, in some cases part funding, has to go through some sort of scrutiny. I don't think we're going to wind back to the days where an individual in a local authority would say we're good to go or we're not. But it could be, or it is, sorry, in a lot of places, and Stockport's a great example. The procurement process there was an OG procurement. I think we got through it in certainly less than 9 months, start to finish. There's one elsewhere in the country, up in the northeast. I won't name the local authority. We were a year and a half. We spent £500,000, as did 2 other developers, to bid for. It was actually a public sector building, and I won't tell you who won it, but they definitely chose the wrong partner, and they're regretting it now. So it can be an impediment. I know exactly what the contributor in the audience was getting at, but done right, and Manchester's a great example, Alison. When you were around, you know, they play by the rules, but they interpret the rules. They're bold enough and courageous enough to choose the right people within a framework. And I just think where there are less experienced scrutineers within local authorities, you might get the wrong answer. Yeah. But I do think it's got a lot better, and I think it's here to stay. But I think you can.
Having properly resourced teams that are used to going through a competitive process on the client side. So you're really thinking about what are you really buying and looking at value rather than just cost. So I'd agree with what Matt said. We've all run the gauntlet of ODU processes over the years, but I mean, we went through all the ODU process on the Olympics, and I mean, that was a very accelerated program, and we still got some stunning buildings like the Velodrome and the Olympic Park. I mean, there's ways and means of doing it, but I hope the post ODU procurement process will be a lot smarter, a lot less clunky, and we need to be getting on with this, so hopefully a lot shorter as well, or streamlined.
Yeah. And I think certainly, in fact, we've been involved as a business in a number of procurement processes, and I think hopefully that's where, to support local authorities to procure a development partner, but the ability to understand the thinking of developers as well. So knowing that, Matt, you don't want to be part of a 20 long shortlist, and then the amount of money that you have to spend in doing that. You would rather that there was a very clear, and you can make a decision as to whether it's the right thing for you, and the local authority can make the right decision, as opposed to it being a very long protracted, and in some cases the decision is not to go forward with it anyway, and everybody's spent a lot of time and effort. And particularly to the point, I think a number of you have already raised that, you know, a number of our local authorities have very limited resources, and we need to think about how to support those in the most effective way, but by aligning with the right public sector partners. But we do clearly need to have a structure in place to ensure value for money and appropriate spending of public money. Tom, do you want to add anything around that, the sort of procurement point?
Not especially. I mean, others are much more experienced at the sort of coal-face delivery side, but I think the sort of theme of partnership and how you support capacity in places that maybe just don't have the experience, they haven't done it before, where we can find willing private sector partners to sort of help coach and educate. I think that's with the thrust of what others have said. So I'll stop there, Caroline.
Yeah, and actually that. Sorry, Alison.
I also think you know, the public sector has got a broader role to play of helping to de-risk. So having a clear, if I'm thinking about what made Manchester really successful, not just rebuilding the city centre post 96, but, you know, Ancoats, East Manchester, whatever, it's that deep understanding of what you need to do to create a clear plan, and then a sort of investable proposition, and thinking about, well, you know, how do you actually de-risk for the private sector? So can you streamline planning? Can you do site assembly? You know, what can you do in terms of how you sort of structure your plan so that you've got an investable proposition, and that you can actually think quite forwardly about how you create that long-term value, not just for your development partners, but also for the whole community. And I think that's what they're trying to do in Stockport, from conversations I've had with Bob, is just to get that real back. Because at the end of the day, we need to think, why are we doing this and who are we doing this for? And actually, it's a lot about the people, our communities that live in these places. And we have to create places that have people right at the heart of them. And then the economic benefits and the jobs and everything will then flow from that.
No, and I think one of the consistent messages and best practice examples that we've touched on so far is really around that sense of leadership. There's a question from the audience that is where we have authorities that don't necessarily have that strong leadership. What can we do to sort of support them to be making better or the right decisions? And I know with sort of my experience as a sort of consultant who works both with the private and the public sector is that organisations like ourselves who understand the priorities of the policy agenda and the drivers of the private sector can sometimes support in that, so that a local authority that doesn't have a great understanding around the market isn't trying to pursue something that is never going to be delivered, but you can think about how you start to align the aspirations of the public sector and the needs, the responses that the public sector is doing, but making sure that it does align better with the private sector. But I'd be quite interested, Matt, to put that question to you, where you've come across, I'm not going to get you to name any, don't worry, weaker authorities or less experienced local authorities. What do you think needs to be done to sort of really help them to get in a better place, particularly where they may be needing to bid and really make a strong case to access some of the funding that is available? Let's presume that all the authorities, they're weaker in the sense that they maybe haven't got the experience or maybe the capacity weaker. I guess it's a number of things, really. If they're open enough to trust others, then I think weaker authorities could lean a lot more on the private sector for help. There's a lot of private sector developers who are happy to go the extra mile without any sort of commitment to, come up with bright ideas, call them critical friends. We often go into authorities as a critical friend, fully acknowledging that ultimately we have to go through the dreaded OG process, but at least we've learned a little bit about the town centre, we've got to know the people. I think if they were bold enough and confident enough to seek help from other authorities where they've seen things happen and not be too proud to pick up the phone to a neighbouring authority, competing authority, I've got this issue, I don't know, and a challenge, I don't know how to address it. How did you address this particular town centre or this particular issue? So sort of dropping pride and consulting with other neighbouring, or not necessarily neighbouring authorities, other authorities. And then you were pleased, I'm about to say, Caroline, and appointing decent consultants who, have been around the block, don't take that the wrong way, who I should have said, experienced.
Highly experienced is what I should have said. Highly experienced, who they can trust to help them and guide them through the decision making. So I guess weaker authorities, if they are confident enough, if that's not a contradiction, to go and ask for help, either from the private sector, from neighbouring authorities, or from experienced consultants.
This was a really key theme from the Urban Centre Recovery Task Force. So all of those ideas were thought about and sort of buddying processes. I think the combined authorities can really bring together sort of centres of excellence and share resources. And Andy Street was giving some really good examples of how that happens in the West Midlands. And agencies like Homes England, providing expertise that they can, really sort of parachute in and help support, putting together plans, and it's sort of critical points in the process. So I think, all those ideas are sort of really important to sort of helping everyone to be able to sort of unlock that sort of potential, if you like. So I do think, it's really important. I know what everyone's saying about the jam, but, every place has the seeds of its own regeneration and has the potential to contribute more. And it's just finding what that is. and so they just don't feel completely abandoned and left behind. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that theme's really interesting. I think, and it's sort of what we're really seeing with the transformation of town centres at the moment. So historically, it was, I know when I was doing regeneration strategies, the first thing most local authorities asked me was, how do you get a Debenhams or how do you get a Marks and Spencers? Because that's what will bring people in. And a positive thing of the chaos or the difficulty we've been going through with the town centres is actually nobody is starting from that question now. And they are starting from, what is great about my town? Why is it different than other places? What can I do to make it fulfill its potential? So from my perspective, I think, you have to take silver linings from changing economic circumstances, but that ability for people to really see the uniqueness of their place and to understand their place, and then to use that as a platform to drive forward. Hopefully, Tom, that's a sort of good way to bring you in to see clearly, part of the area we wanted to cover off today was the town centres, and we touched on it a little bit at the start. But I think from your perspective, how much do you see the levelling up agenda as really being the driving force for the transformation of town centres, or do you think actually quite a lot of the sort of thinking around town centres has been picked up through some of the the Future High Street and the task force, and this needs to be looking at some of the other areas such as productivity or?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. You sort of answered the question. There are obviously already significant funds on the table allocated to very many places, both on the high streets and towns fund side. And at this point on capacity, I've not been close to the fund design whilst working in DEFRA, but I think built in explicitly the sort of consultancy support, recognising precisely the issue that we talked about. And I think MHCLG colleagues get that and understand it, but I'd be very interested to hear feedback. If not, I think levelling up, as is obvious from this whole conversation and from what I said at the start, is a hugely broad topic. I think it will build on what the government has already done and what we are doing on towns. So it's not sort of levelling up is something different. And too early to say where the exact gaps in the policy framework are. We've talked about some of them. I think it will build on and consolidate what we are doing. So I think, Caroline, that's the best way of responding. And levelling up has a sort of a breadth at the moment that means it encompasses a lot of things, but should certainly build on the success. The crucial thing about towns, I think, is it enabled a targeting, a focus that in the work, as I say, I was doing previously through LEPs and at city region level, that targeted focus on towns, which trigger all those emotions about pride and about sort of where the real impacts of economic transition are felt, wasn't there. And levelling up, what we say, what the white paper does, will continue that, including, I think, applying some of the very practical delivery lessons, which we've also started to touch on here. So again, I'll stop there, Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alison, if I can bring you in here on something that I know you're passionate about, it's really around the sustainability agenda and where that sits. And I think for me, it's really exciting. I think when we've been through other periods of economic difficulty as we're coming out of now, certainly if I look back to something like the financial crisis, as we came out of the financial crisis, we almost forgot about or pushed it to one side, the whole sustainability agenda that had been sort of building up. But I think what we've definitely seen through COVID is actually the sustainability agenda. I know, Matt, you're busy doing, pushing it, building sustainability, particularly in a number of schemes you're involved in, but that has become even more important through COVID as we move out. I think I'd be interested to hear your views on how we potentially use this difficult time to really catapult some of the sustainability agenda in light of how we need to think about the new normal coming out of COVID.
Yeah, I think the race to level up and the race to zero have to come together, and the built environment sits at the heart of that. It's responsible for 40% of carbon emissions. So if you like, our industry is part of the problem, but we're also a huge part of the solution. And I do think there's an opportunity to really sort of stand back with all the changes happening on sort of technology, as I say, working from home, just how we consume things differently, whether it's culture, food, you know, there's a lot changing at the moment, and there's a real opportunity to rethink our urban areas. I mean, some of them were already challenged for some years, well before COVID arrived, but obviously some of those changes have been accelerated by the pandemic. And I think it's quite exciting that there's cities out there actually being quite radical. So places like Nottingham demolishing big parts of the Broadmarsh Centre, or Stockton actually taking out a whole shopping centre that's sort of defunct, and thinking about actually how do we reimagine the town centre and the river and sort of the quality of environment. So I think there's a lot of changes coming. I think we need to think as an industry quite differently, not just about carbon in use and, as I say, the race to zero carbon, but also really shifting gear in terms of innovation, you know, smarter buildings, things like, you know, all the energy that goes into buildings, green steel, green concrete. I think we need to fundamentally think about retrofit. So we knock down 50,000 buildings a year, every year in this country, which is extraordinary. And actually thinking through, actually, can we reshape, retrofit, reuse differently, use more intensively, and just be less wasteful in thinking about how we develop our towns and cities. And also, I think on the positive side of COVID, I think people have really become much more thinking local, supporting their local shops, things like parks and gardens and green space. So bringing the ecology back into the city and really thinking about, you know, places that people love, you know, really creating value, but as I say, in a sort of broader sense of value. So city centres that are greener, more mixed use, more housing. I love this concept of the 15-minute city. So I think there's a real opportunity for a bit of radical thinking, and I think it's starting to happen. Yeah. And I just encourage people to, you know, not just rely on stuff that we've done before and repeat it, because that just isn't going to work this time round.
And Matt, that's probably a great opportunity to give you a few moments of the minutes that we've got left, just to flag up your experience. As I said, I'm conscious that it's something that Muse is taking very seriously and thinking about the new buildings that it's bringing forward, even before, you know, COVID, looking at a number of new ways of innovating with future buildings.
Yeah, and it's right at the heart of what we're doing, not just the buildings that we're developing and the places we're changing, but right down to how we behave around the office. I'm on holiday this week, but I got a Yammer post in, and it's plastic-free Wednesday around the office. So nobody is allowed to consume anything, do anything with a single-use plastic involved. And it's just prompting people to change and move away from tradition, which I suppose is a bit like, you know, the town centres. We were driving in, parking in multi-storey car parks and shopping and packing our cars and driving home. This 15-minute city, I agree, is, you know, it would be utopia, wouldn't it? You know, we live, we work, we enjoy, we play in the same place, but it's exciting enough for us not really to want to go and do anything else. So to create a town centre that can achieve those things, you know, I think has to be the goal. And again, playing in Stockport are doing a great job of that. You know, they were bold enough to buy the Mersey Shopping Centre. Tricky to, I know, talk about demolishing buildings. I don't think there's a lot else you can do with Mersey, to be honest, but, you know, and the Broadmarsh Centre is another great example where local authorities are intervening in their own places to make town centres better. And I think as towns have grown incrementally, it's less difficult to repurpose them, because you can repurpose them in segments. You try and repurpose the Broadmarsh Centre, or, I mean, Stockton did a great example, buying the two shopping centres, decanting the two half-full shopping centres into one full shopping centre, demolish the one by the river, and bingo. You know, it was bold. It was really, really bold for them to do that, but it was less difficult, I guess, than Stockport's challenge, which they're embracing, of trying to tackle the voids within Merseyway and backfilling that space with compatible and complementary uses. And then in terms of sort of the road to net zero, yeah, we've got our first, in fact, starting on site, signing an enabling works contract last week on a big building in Salford, which will be net zero in operation. And what's quite interesting is there are compromises to that. To have a net zero building, you have to have less windows. We have to have more columns to use less concrete. You can't have your cooling down to 19 degrees on a hot day because you can't do that on a net zero in use basis. So everybody has to begin to learn, if we're going to get there, there's going to have to be compromises. And it's similar with the passive house that we're working on, that the design of those buildings is different to what we've all been used to. But I think the seismic shock we've all had through COVID, I think we're ready for it. I think we're ready for that sort of change. We've coped over the last 18 months with something none of us have experienced in our lifetime across the globe. And I think we're ready for change. And I think it's helped us sort of realise that, getting in the car every day, driving to work every day is not necessarily the right thing to be doing. Yeah. So turning it back to the sort of levelling up agenda, if we can, focus some of those resources initiatives around green travel, around 15-minute cities, that would be really, really good. Really good.
Yeah. And Tom, I think if I can bring you in, probably almost as sort of the concluding comments, but I think that we touched on connectivity, we touched on infrastructure. There's a question around concerns around possibly, cuts in infrastructure spending. And clearly, as you've said, needing to look at a levelling up agenda in the round. Have you got any comments around that? That thinking around how we move and how we are using infrastructure aligned to what we're trying to do around the levelling up agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a couple of quick thoughts. Firstly, we're writing a white paper at the very centre of Whitehall, and so many of these issues are, to repeat a point I made earlier, very necessarily place specific. And so the thrust of the white paper, I think, will be to try and get both the experiences we've shared here in this sort of discussion and the tools and the levers and the flexibility right, so that local leaders can, whatever the formulation of the 15-minute city is across the country, seek to address that. Clearly it needs partnering, clearly it needs access to expertise and knowledge. But, I don't think we've got a blueprint version of that in our team, and nor will we, but we're very interested on the back of this sort of conversation to draw up examples, case studies and others, and to hear where specific policy changes may make that easier. So that's the first point. I mean, secondly, as you said in my biography, I was the Director of Environment Strategy in DEFRA for 18 months prior to starting this job. So some experience of working on the net zero agenda, which of course has led in bays, but the sort of amount of policy thinking going on in departments about how to close the gap on current actions towards net zero, and the government will publish a net zero strategy later in the year ahead of COP26, is huge, and it speaks to all the things that Matt's just raised. And then the third thing I just wanted to add, so I was responsible for the 25-year environment plan bill that's going through Parliament, the environment bill. So as well as the net zero challenge, it's really some important changes coming on wider environmental targets on biodiversity, on waste use, on resources. And I'd encourage everyone in the audience and those in the industry to make sure you know what's in that piece of legislation as well as net zero. It's a bit further behind in terms of the legal framework, but equally significant changes. So I think there are other places other than levelling up where I think the environment story will be told in the net zero strategy, and as the environment bill becomes legislation. But what levelling up should embrace is all of that agenda and the tools and freedoms to do regeneration in a way that's supportive. So again, Caroline, I'll stop there with a kind of high level overview.
No, that's great, Tom, and I think it's been really interesting to hear your views, and I think importantly for you to say that this is a dialogue that you want to continue with all of us in our different guises to give us an opportunity to support you in the work that you're currently doing around the policy agenda. So thank you for that opportunity.
Am I back on screen? Hello. Thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I thought it was a brilliant session. So thank you to Alison, thank you to Matt, thank you to Tom, and obviously to our fabulous chair this morning, Caroline. I'm not going to try and summarise that. There's so much good stuff that's been talked about and covered off, but there are a couple of key sort of takeaways I've singled out. And interestingly, Tom kicked off saying levelling up isn't a traditional growth or city region agenda. It's about connecting region with communities, community reform, not just in cities, but across every part of the country, with people at the heart of the decisions. I thought that was quite telling. I thought it was really interesting. I mean, the world, as Alison said, the world is changing at an incredibly fast rate, with so many different and critical elements to consider as we move forward with our strategies. But the recurring theme throughout the whole of the session was again strong leadership combined with a truly collaborative public and private sector partnerships. I think that is absolutely critical, and obviously that fits in line with the Movers and Shakers mission for 2021. We won't stop after 2021 with that initiative, because obviously the public and private partnerships are thankfully here to stay, but obviously they're critical. And it'll be fascinating to see the outcome of the white paper and what strategies are created as a result of that. And Tom, it would be great to have you back in the autumn when we have sight of the white paper to have a further conversation about that. So yeah, rest assured you'll receive an invite at some point. The session will be available on social media and on YouTube at some point in the not too distant future. So if there are colleagues or friends who you feel might get some value out of today, I'm sure they will do. Please feel free to forward that on. Our next event is 15th of July, so it's next Thursday, next week, and that's a city focus and sort of inward investment surrounding the Birmingham area, and building back to business is one of the key topics today, on Thursday, sorry. Thank you once again to our sponsors, Muse. Thank you to Stockport Council and Stockport MDC, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. I do hope you found it of value. So from everyone at Movers and Shakers, have a great remainder of the week. Stay safe, and we all look forward to seeing you very soon. Many thanks. Cheerio. Bye.